Well, I think in general, Red Hat has emerged as by far the leading enterprise Linux. We have 80+% share globally. I think in our most recent quarter, we had over 200 million of billings, and our next closest competitor, I think in their most recent quarter, had 30 something. So we've clearly emerged as the leader in enterprise Linux, and Linux more broadly has emerged as the operating system for next generation architectures. You want to call that cloud computing or software as a service. If you're using Salesforce.com, if you're using almost any software as a service, you're using open source and Linux. The IDC and others have numbers around that, and it looks like it's about 25% of servers roughly are being shipped are with Linux, and obviously the vast majority of that's with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That's consistent with share type numbers that we see around the world. So the adoption here, I think, is robust and typical of what we see. I think that understates the overall importance and impact of Linux. The reason I say that is there's a lot of what you think of as the basic kind of mail servers and things like that that are just by default because of Microsoft Exchange running Windows. If you look at our real share of production applications in a data center, we think it's substantially higher than that in India and around the world. Well, it's hard for me to separate cloud computing from open source for the simple reason is cloud computing could not exist without the economics and the innovation around open source. So, a simple example, I think estimates are Google has 10,000 servers. I'm sorry, 10 million servers. And even if you take a very discounted price, if you take the operating system, database, clustering, backup, storage, application server, a typical stack of software sitting on a server, even highly, highly discounted because of the size, $1,000 to $2,000 a server, that would say Google has basically somewhere between 10 and $20 billion worth of spend that they're avoiding by using open source. Clouds in general run open source. Businesses built, whether it's software as a service or infrastructure as a service type companies, are built on open source. So there's a real blurring to me between cloud computing and what I think of as a modular open source architecture. Well, we're an infrastructure software company. I think it's important for any company to really understand what they're good at. And Red Hat, our mission statement is to be the catalyst in communities of contributors and customers and partners developing technology the open source way. And what that means is we're a software company. And so we certainly intend to power the world's major clouds. And if you look at major cloud announcements in the last few months, whether it's IBM or NTT, they're running Red Hat's virtualization and Red Hat's infrastructure. So we certainly plan to power the world's public and private clouds, but we're not also in the business of wanting to compete with our partners through the channels and direct engagements with the cloud providers. 80% of our revenues come from subscriptions. Now, what makes up that subscription is a series of services. And again, about 20% of our cost structure is support. I think often people think Red Hat provides support on top of Linux. A larger portion of our cost structure is the R&D expense of actually stabilizing bits and committing to support those for 9 to 10 years. And so we have, against every release of Enterprise Linux, we put 40 to 60 engineers that's going to stay with that release through its entire life cycle, so 9 to 10 years. And that has a significant cost for us, but it's also how we're able to offer real SLA level support for production applications. We are in the desktop business for our enterprise customers. So enterprise customers who want a common code base across their Linux portfolio, we absolutely are there and we continue to invest. When RHEL 6 comes out, we'll have an extraordinary update to our desktop offerings. At this point, we don't have plans for a consumer desktop. I think it's important, very few companies can sell to all users. As I'll often say internally, there are companies that sell hundreds of dollars to millions of customers, and there are companies that sell millions of dollars to hundreds of customers. We sell millions of dollars to hundreds of customers. That's where our strength lies, that's where our capabilities are, and that's what we'll continue to focus on. Well, I'm very pleased to see the explosion of interest in Android. There are numbers now that say Android has overtaken the iPhone in terms of number of units shipped. I think it's great to see. Red Hat doesn't directly play in that space, but the more people who are developing and using open source, and in this case Linux, the more people who participate, ultimately the more people who get involved, and the more people who get involved leads to more people who contribute. And the contribution, it is a single broad code base and set of projects. It's just good for open source to get more people using it. So Red Hat plays indirectly by providing the server backend for all those services that are on the mobile devices, and we're pleased to see that Linux is taking its fair share on the devices themselves.